Shavua Tov, everybody. Tonight, I'm going to be doing a special segment for you, an interview with a Mr. Ronnie Shahar, formerly from Israel. And as you all know, I've been telling my listeners for a long time about the dangers of living in Israel, especially for men, in relation to marriage and divorce issues. And tonight, I'm going to let you, my listeners, hear for yourselves testimony from a person who went through it. And there's nothing like a person telling you his own experience. And with that, I give over the forum to Mr. Ronnie Shahar. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening. First, I'll tell you a bit about myself. I'm 51 years of age, and I made Aliyah to Israel in 2007. I looked at Israel as a Jewish country and a place to live, to start a family, and to be happy in. My life was very good in Israel for a period of 12 years. I set up a business, international business. I bought a very nice apartment, a nice car. I had 3 children, and life was very good. And 2 years ago, I began the divorce process, and it's been hell on earth since. I can't even describe it in words. It's a man who has everything, has a loving home, 3 children, a nice car, a nice business, is all of a sudden thrown on the street just because of the divorce process. Because what happens in the divorce process in Israel is that the man is completely massacred by either the rabbinical courts or the family court. And he loses everything. Overnight, he's out of his home. He can't see his children. He's locked in the country with a no exit order, just simply based on the question that he may leave the country and not return. He's kept in the country with and hostaged in the country, which is horrific. And in general, you don't believe this is possible in a democratic society, that the system can treat you this way. In fact, it does. You have no human rights in Israel whatsoever. The family court, the rabbinical court, is completely biased in favor of the woman. It already decides before the case proceeds that the children will stay in Israel, the woman will keep all the assets, and the man will have to guarantee future child support till the children reach the age of 18. And if the man can't come up with the money, his life is destroyed. He's locked in the country. He can't leave, and automatically a no exit order is granted, and the man is held hostage unless his family can bail him out, and it becomes a disaster. And people have to be warned of the consequences of making Aliyah to Israel. These agencies like Nefesh B'Nefesh and the Jewish Agency, they encourage Aliyah. They tell people, no problem, you're coming to a Jewish country, you'll meet a Jewish woman, you'll have a Jewish life, you'll be living in the promised land. You'll be taken care of by the state. The state is here to help you. And that's how I felt for a period of 12 years. And then the reality is the state is there to murder you. The state actually only has the intention of keeping your children at all costs, regardless whether you're a better father than the woman is a mother, and to keep you, to guarantee your payment of child support. And in this case, you're made homeless automatically by the system. You're removed from your children's lives, and women use the system very effectively, because a woman can file a false violence complaint in Israel with no evidence of a crime whatsoever, no history of any violence, and you're automatically removed from the home with a exit order that you're forced not to be within a mile of your home, and that's it. It's automatically. There's no evidence at all.
Now let me ask you, Ronnie. You're from Australia originally, but you lived in Israel. How do the laws in Israel differ from the United States or Australia in regarding to child support and custody? Why do you feel it's worse in Israel?
Well, there's no comparison between Israel and any other developed nation in the world. First seen in an overseas court by the United States, Canada, Australia, England. There is basic assumption that the person can pay child support based on his income. And the system is also fair. A woman cannot make a false violence complaint in the United States or Australia or England and get away with it. But in Israel, it's an accepted norm. There is no prosecution of women making false violence complaints. And it's encouraged by lawyers in Israel for a woman, in order to extract the husband from the home. It's the simplest method. It's automatic. It's a guarantee of success. And in Israel, they calculate child support based on your future, your past earnings. You're a successful businessman earning a lot of money, and they don't care. When they locked you in the country, you have no income in Israel. So I have no income and no business in Israel whatsoever. So I'm locked in the country. I can't earn a shekel. I can't earn a dollar. I can't earn anything. My business is going to the wall.
No, but please tell our listeners where your business was that made it very difficult for you to pay child support.
Yeah, I had an international business in many countries worldwide, and my business required me to travel on a regular basis. I had to travel to many countries in order to make a living. And the moment I was trapped in Israel with a no exit order, within a year, my business collapsed completely. I lost all my deposits to my business. I lost my contracts with people. I lost my partnerships. Everything was completely destroyed, and I was bankrupted.
And did they still make you pay the same child support, whether you had the business or not?
Yes. They say to me, fine, you're earning $20,000 a month in the past. You were living a very high quality of life. You were paying for private schooling for your children, nice quality holidays for your children, and a very high standard of living, which I wanted to continue providing. They didn't care. I told to the judge's face, I said to herself, listen, if you lock me in the country, I have no way to continue paying private schooling for my kids. My business will be bankrupted and I'll lose everything. They did not care. I was talking to a brick wall. I wasn't talking to a human being. That's how I felt.
Now, this was with the secular court in Israel?
Yes, this is with the family court in Israel.
Family court. And what are the rabbinical courts? How would they operate? Any different than the secular courts?
The rabbinical courts and the family courts are all the same. There's no real difference. There is no difference whatsoever in that regard. All the rights are given to a woman. The only concern they have is for the man to pay ridiculous amounts of child support, whether he has the funds or doesn't have the funds, or he can work or can't work. There's no relevance to them as well.
So what happens in a situation where a guy cannot work, he doesn't have his business, and he owes, how much money does he have to owe in order for them to put him in jail, for example, or prison for lack of child support?
Unofficially, there's no actual statistic on that, but they're saying if a man misses 3 months of child support and he has a debt of $4,000 or $5,000 equivalent, he's automatically arrested and sentenced to 21 days in prison for a contempt of court for not paying child support. It doesn't matter if he's homeless, he can't work, he's in hospital. It means nothing in Israel, nothing whatsoever.
In the United States, we have a system where if a person loses money, they can ask for a degrading of child support, to pay less. You don't have that in Israel? The judge can...
We have that in Israel, but the question is they don't listen. You can plead with a judge and say, listen, it's an extreme change of circumstances. Before I was earning a lot of money, now I'm earning nothing. My business has gone to the wall. There has to be a solution made that I can continue my work in order to pay child support, in order to take care of my children and myself. But they don't care. And in my case, which is extreme, in many cases, the judge appoints an atropos, a lawyer to represent the children's interests. And in my case, this lawyer was on my side and pleaded with the judge and wrote to the judge a year ago and said, you got to release this guy to be able to work abroad. Otherwise, you won't be able to take care of the kids. And the children will suffer in the long term from this. The judge simply did not listen. They said, you pay the security deposit or you stay in Israel for life. That's how it is.
Now, why would the judge not let the man see his children? What prevents him from seeing the children?
Please speak up. It's quite quiet. I don't hear you so well, the question.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
What prevents a man from seeing his children? What happens there?
Well, firstly, the man is removed from his home with a court order on a false violence complaint in most cases. They say 88% of claims made to the police in order to remove the husband from his home are false, is used as a tactic in negotiation. And the moment the man is out of his home, he has no access to his children.
Right.
They decide that social worker is appointed. In my case, the social worker wasn't so bad. She wanted me to have proper contact with my children. But you don't have any rights. It's not enforced. So a woman who's living in the family home simply does not open the door. So the husband is cut off from his children. He has no rights. The police will not get involved. They consider it a civil matter. And they'll simply say it's not our issue. Go back to court. And the process goes on and on and on and on. In the meantime, parental alienation kicks off. And the man sees himself in court as nothing. He's only a number. He's not a human being anymore.
Is it
He
true?
has no rights to contact his children.
Is it true what I hear, that there is a large amount of men who commit suicide in Israel because of this?
Yes, apparently there's different figures, but they're saying that it's more than 300 to 400 men a year committing suicide. That a man who's going through divorce or divorced is 7 times more likely to commit suicide than a man who's married, which is a horrific statistic. And in fact, that many suicides aren't counted as suicides. Traffic accidents where a man kills himself are considered an accident when in fact it's a suicide. So the real numbers perhaps could be many multiples of the official figures. It could be 1,000 men a year or more who commit suicide. And it's very understandable as to why they do that. They're completely destroyed. They're removed from their homes. They have no contact with their children. They're locked in the country with a no exit order. And they're hopeless. They're being chased by the sheriff's office for payment of child support they can't pay. They're being treated like a criminal on the run. And there's no compassion in the society at all in Israel in this regard. They do not care if the man is not working, he can't travel abroad. And in many cases, there's foreign men who come from other countries who have their families abroad. They're trapped in Israel. They can't leave. So in my case,
I want you to elaborate that about foreign men visiting Israel. What do you mean by that? How do they get trapped if they don't live in Israel?
Foreign men visiting Israel. They may not even be citizens of Israel. They have no real connection to Israel. They're living, for instance, in the United States or Canada or Australia, and they're coming to visit their children. They've gone through an amicable divorce years earlier, and they want to come and visit their children in Israel. They want to come to a bar mitzvah. They want to come to a birthday, and they come into Israel, and all of a sudden the ex-wife takes out a no exit order on them and says, "Oh, now I've decided I wanted to guarantee future child support."
But 1 minute, if he's paying child support by American court order, why would the Israeli courts get involved?
They get involved because they could simply say the woman's claiming the husband may not pay child support in the future. And they want to guarantee child support to the age of 18 years of age per child. And they say, okay, now we request a guarantee. There's a risk the man will leave Israel now and not pay child support. So we want a no exit order issued automatically and force the man to pay the child support until the age of 18 for each child.
And what does the American courts say to that, since they have jurisdiction on the child support?
Well, the issue is this. The Israeli courts, in all cases, ignore overseas court orders. An agreement, a prenuptial agreement may be signed in another country. An agreement between both parties is signed before the parties make aliyah to Israel, who decide to come and live in Israel. And in case of divorce, what the settlement will be and how child support will be calculated on where the children will live. But the Israeli courts ignore those overseas decisions. They simply ignore overseas agreements which were signed and endorsed by an overseas court. The Israeli court claims that it has jurisdiction in every case, and the Israeli court's only consideration is to keep the children in Israel at all cost, and for the father to pay child support. They do not give a damn if the father has been living in another country, his income is in another country. They do not care whatsoever. So
what you're saying is, which is new to me, I didn't know this. I used to think that the Israeli Rabbinate, the Rabbinate, gets involved only with a man who didn't give a get to his wife. But you're telling me even if he gave her a get, they will trap you there for child support, even though it's being handled by an American court.
Exactly. The rabbinical court does not want to leave women chained, they claim. So they'll kick, the first step is an automatic no exit order until the man grants the get. And they'll tell the man, that's it. You're not leaving the country until you grant the woman a get. We don't care if the proceedings are abroad. We don't care if you request that all other financial considerations are made first. We've decided you're staying in Israel with a no exit order. And it's a form of extortion. A man is forced to give a get when he's not ready to give a get. He's forced to give a get, and the get is used as an extortion tool to trap the man in Israel. And they know it works in most cases because the man is left destitute in Israel. If the man is working abroad, his livelihood abroad is destroyed, his future is destroyed, and is forced to give a get under incredible duress. And even when he gives a get and he thinks, okay, I'm now free, I can continue my life, he comes back to Israel to visit his children a year or two later, and he can be trapped in the country again. They said, oh, now we've decided you're a risk, you may not pay future child support.
Wow.
There's no evidence. There's no evidence of non-future child support, but we decided we're going to lock you in the country anyway.
What does the foreign governments like Australia, the United States, or other governments say to this blatant international violation of human rights?
You see, in my case, I've contacted other embassies in Israel, the British Embassy, the US Embassy, the Canadian Embassy. All of them, they say they consider this particular point to be a private legal affair, a private legal matter, which is a sovereignty issue of the state of Israel. They cannot involve themselves in the domestic issues of law.
How can they call this a private matter when you have a foreign citizen who's under the jurisdiction of a foreign court, paying his child support? He's just coming to a visit, just coming to visit Israel. He doesn't know he's going to be trapped there. What do you mean it's a private? It's not a private legal matter.
Well, that's what they consider. They simply do not want to challenge the state of Israel and create a diplomatic incident with Israel by saying, listen, you can't do this to our citizens. This is not legal. This is a breach of human rights of international law to entrap someone in such a way. There is actually no country in the world who traps people on future obligations. There is no country in the world. There's countries in the third world like Turkey, like the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, who hold people to pay off debts. And they say you cannot leave the country until your outstanding debts are paid. But in Israel, it's nothing to do with debts. It's concerned with future obligations and what the obligation may be in the future. And in some cases, you're talking about 15 years in the future. So they're saying, okay, you don't owe any money now, but we're still going to trap you in the country because there's a risk potentially that 10 years down the road, you're not going to pay. So we want to guarantee those payments. But the only way we can do that is by locking you in the country.
Yeah, but will they do that for even when the wife and the man live abroad? Will they take his money? Or that's only if the woman lives in Israel?
They don't care. In many cases, a man who migrates to Israel is going through divorce proceedings, is already clearly divorced years earlier. He's paying child support. He has an ongoing relationship with his children. He may be remarried in another country, and all of a sudden he comes to visit his children in Israel. He's trapped in the country. The rabbinical court and the family court in Israel do not give a damn that the man has a family abroad, has his new life abroad, and they'll trap him in the country. I've seen it happen many, many times. There's no concern whatsoever for the man's new wife or his new children, a new family, and his new employment. They do not care at all. It's an automatic process.
Okay, so
first they'll trap the man in Israel and they extort him for money.
Okay, so let me understand this. Let's say you have a man who's divorced, gave his wife a get. He lives with his new wife in the United States. Let's say his ex-wife is also living in the United States. He visits somebody in Israel. Now, if they trap him in Israel and his job is in the United States, how is he supposed to make a living and pay his wife future payments?
That's exact question I asked the judge in my case, and the judge didn't care. It was like it was bounced off the wall. I said in my case as well, how do you expect me to survive? How do you expect me to pay? The judge does not care. I confronted the judge in my case. The judge said to me, you should continue your private schooling of your children. You should find the money. I said, Judge, listen, how do you expect me to pay if I'm allowed to work?
And Ronnie, let me just be clear. You already gave your wife a get, right?
Yes.
And they still treated you like this. Okay.
Exactly.
So it's not just about the get.
I was trapped.
Right.
I was trapped to give her a get. Then I was trapped on future child support payments from the sheriff's office. We call it in British English, the bailiff's office. I was trapped in Israel on that as well. They all demand guarantees in every aspect. The family court requires a guarantee. The Otsala Pol, which they call the sheriff's office, the bailiff's office, wants a guarantee. The rabbinical court wants the get deposited. And all of these authorities have the power to lock you in the country. Each separate authority, you finish with one, another one will lock you in the country. And it's a never-ending process.
And I'm assuming the men who are committing suicide do so because they find there's nowhere to escape. They cannot go to Jordan. They cannot go to Egypt. All enemies of Israel. They're basically stuck. It's not like an American can run away to Canada or run away to Mexico. You don't have that in Israel.
That's exactly the point. And in many cases, the man sees suicide as his only way to reduce his suffering. He gets to the point where he gives up the will to live. He's lost everything. He's lost his children. He's lost his home, his employment, his ability to generate an income. He's being harassed and treated as a fugitive by the Otsala Pol, which is the collections office, to be hounded and imprisoned in prison as a criminal because he can't work and he can't pay. So he says, what am I living for? I can't live.
So I'm not, I I don't mean to make fun, make a joke like this, but in a certain way, a man is better off sitting in prison where he's fed and he has a roof over his head and than being on the streets and homeless.
Yes, in the short term, yes, but what it does, it's a punitive measure. It doesn't eradicate the child support payments.
Oh, okay.
It's a revolving door. So the man will sit 21 days in prison, he'll be released, and a month later, they can take out a new arrest warrant. So it can be an endless process where they can arrest the man 3 or 4 times a year and send him to jail. It doesn't wipe out the child support payment. The child support payments continue.
So Ronnie, tell our listeners, so what is the ultimate advice you want to give to our listeners about the state of Israel?
Okay, the ultimate advice I can give you, a man has to be clinically insane, knowing what I know now and what some of the viewers know about this system, to even consider coming to live in the state of Israel or marrying an Israeli woman. He's playing with his life. It's a game of Russian roulette. Everything can be fine in Israel as long as you're married. But the moment there's a divorce process in Israel, you have no rights. Automatically, you're guaranteed to lose everything. You lose your children. The children remain in Israel. You have no rights to custody, no rights to visitation, no rights to the assets. The assets are automatically given to a woman. The car is given to the woman. The possessions inside the home are given to the woman. And the man is trapped. He's destroyed. Overnight, the man is destroyed. And he can't win. He thinks to himself, okay, he can win. He can hire a lawyer and everything will be good. Justice will be served. There is no justice in Israel, not in the family court and not in the rabbinical court. The process is very clear. The man is completely, utterly destroyed by the process.
Okay. So what else should a person know? What else do you want to tell them besides marrying? I mean, I understand also that some American lawyers have been advising their clients, their female clients, that if they want to get divorced, just go directly to the state of Israel and have your husband come with you on vacation as a pretense to trap him there. Have you heard that?
Yes, exactly. Lawyers in North America, be in Boston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, are telling women, if you want to get divorced, you're planning to get divorced, keep it quiet, lure your husband to Israel with the children, and you're guaranteed to win the divorce case. You're guaranteed custody of your children. You're guaranteed everything. You can extort the man for whatever you want. He's going to be trapped in Israel automatically in the process. It doesn't matter if the marriage was in the United States or in Israel. It's not relevant to these courts in Israel. They will murder the man. They will take everything from him. They'll trap him in the country and extort him for every cent they can out of him.
This is very monumental to me. This whole thing is very monumental. I mean, imagine, I think you would agree with me that a person's greatest possession in life is his family, his wife, his children. Nothing supersedes that. And we all, as young people, aspire to start a family and have a beautiful life. And then all of a sudden, in 1 second, it could be snuffed away from us by a political, legal system that's corrupted. And I always wonder to myself, what would the sages, the rabbis of thousands of years ago, who were the rabbis of the Talmud, would say about marriage if they found out what's happening? I mean, it's literally, like they say in Hebrew, sakanat nefoshot. It's a danger for a man, because when a man is trapped in Israel and that leads him to suicide, it now turns divorce into a dangerous proposition. It's no different than you or I going to Gaza, right? That there's a 50% chance or more you'll die, I'll die, we won't get out of there. So nobody is addressing this problem. And today in the Jewish world, there's a big shidduch crisis. A lot of people say, oh, I can't find a nice young man. I can't find a nice young. Well, with what's going on, I can understand why men would be very fearful of getting married. Very fearful. So
yeah, listen, I can understand all of that. The issue is we have to look at this system in a broad sense. It doesn't matter if a man is secular, religious, modern religious. The background is of no concern to the system in Israel. The system in Israel has a very clear objective. The objective is they want to encourage a man from North America or any other Western country to bring all his assets and all his money into Israel, to have children in Israel, which they can increase the population. And if something goes wrong, he'll be spat out. they'll take everything from him and extort him for whatever they can from his family. And then they'll release him. When they see that they can't extract anything more from him, then they'll release him. In many cases, the man after 3 years is completely broken physically, the point where they're suffering heart attacks and terrible physical damage caused by the stress of divorce. And then the state decides to release the man abroad because they don't want to spend money on medical expenses for this man. They've taken everything they've got from him. They have no benefit of keeping him in Israel anymore. Then they spit him out. He leaves the country, loses his children, his home, his car, his possessions, everything. He's left penniless, homeless, completely broken mentally, physically, emotionally, psychologically, in every way possible. And then they spit him out. They have no more use for him in Israel anymore. They get rid of him that way.
I don't know if you've been watching my segments on YouTube, my YouTube channel, but in my last segment, I pointed out that besides what you say, that they place these sanctions on the man, they also go after a person's family and they torture the family members. They have no shame or no hesitation in coming after innocent family members as to extort.
Yes, I'll give you an example. For instance, if a man cannot pay child support, the liability is moved on to his parents. It goes up the tree. So if a man has an elderly family in Israel, an elderly father and mother, they can pursue them and say that they're responsible for their son's actions and non-payment of child support. And then they can take them hostage as well by locking them in the country. There's many cases where a man needs to leave for business reasons or family reasons. And they say, fine, provide guarantors. Your father and mother will sign that they're liable for these obligations. So the man and the elderly man and woman are held hostage in Israel until the man returns. This is more barbaric than East Germany or Bolshevik Russia 50 years ago. You see, 50 years ago in East Germany and the Soviet Union, professors at universities could leave the country on overseas visits, provided their children were kept as security in the country. In Israel, children are not security. Money is a security. So it's far more barbaric than the Eastern European communist states and Bolshevik Russia. Hostages are kept, and they don't want. They consider a man not to care about his children, so they want money to be the guarantor, not the children themselves.
Where does this kind of barbaric behavior emanate from? Where do the leaders of Israel get this from?
It's hard to understand. It reminds me of East Germany in the 1970s and 1980s, and just an extreme version of that. That extortion is a way to extract your policies and to enforce your policies. There's nothing about it democratic. This type of issue doesn't exist in any Western country or democracy in the world. I mean, you have to talk about totalitarian states like Iran and North Korea, who practice similar types of measures, but in most cases not against the man for being a man. In Israel, the discrimination is not based on religion, it's based on gender discrimination. A woman has all the rights and a man has nothing. A man is not a human being in Israel. He's only considered to be an ATM machine in the wall to provide money. That's his only purpose. And you have an affiliate, Michal Merevich, in the Labour Party, and she actually considers this policy to be an effective tool. She wants to break the whole foundation of the family and to say a father has only obligation to bring children to the world and to support them financially. He's not needed as a co-parent. He's not needed to perform fatherly care for his children. He's only there as a cash machine to bring children into the world and should be discarded with no rights whatsoever.
Will it help for a man to prevent this atrocities if he would write a prenup with his wife?
Okay, I thought that would protect me as well. A prenuptial agreement in Israel is only valid, the points of the agreement are only valid that provide financial incentives to the woman. If there's certain agreements that the woman has to obey in order to obtain his financial benefits, they're discarded by the court. The court, the rabbinical court or the family court in Israel can cherry pick items out of the agreement and decide only to enforce those points that are favorable to the woman. If there's points that are favorable to the man, like in my prenuptial agreement, which stipulates she cannot take a no exit order against me, they're completely ignored. There is no protection from prenuptial agreement. It's not worth the paper it's written on. The judge can discard any point of the agreement she likes or he likes and simply say, I'm only going to enforce the parts of the agreement that offer money to the woman. Every other part or obligation is considered null and void. I'll give you an example. In my agreement, it stipulates in case of divorce, within 6 months, all assets are divided. Where are we now today? We're 2 years down the path, and the judge ignores that. That's a prerequisite of the agreement. It's simply specified clearly that the assets have to be divided in order to avoid confrontation, and the judge ignores the contract. It's like it doesn't exist. So you ask yourself, what is a prenuptial agreement? It's absolutely not worth the paper it's written on in Israel. It will not protect a man from a no-exit order. It's actually not even legal in Israel to sign a prenuptial agreement that states that the woman cannot lock the man in the country. It's not legal. It's not endorsed by the court.
So I'm assuming that Israel has a divorce rate like the United States, like close to 50%. So you're telling me that every citizen in Israel undergoing divorce will have a no exit order automatically?
Yes. The no exit order in Israel is, you're talking about 15% of the adult population who have no exit orders. If a man is to go into bankruptcy for whatever reason, automatically a no exit order is issued. He can't leave the country. And we're talking about a very dire situation now with COVID in the last 2 years, and many businesses abroad have failed worldwide. In Israel, not enough the man's business is destroyed, he's locked in the country automatically. It's granted automatically by the Otzala Pol, being the bailiff's office. The man is automatically locked in the country automatically. And if he can't find the money to pay these debts, that's it. He's trapped for life in Israel. It's a death sentence.
So essentially, you got to take all the people that have a no exit order and consider them as if they're locked up in a jail cell. Essentially, that's what they are. Just Israel saving itself space in the prisons and letting them stay home, but they still don't have their freedom.
Yeah, with a no exit order, this issue is granted arbitrarily, and the person is trapped. And the no exit order can be for thousands of years. They put the last digits possible in the computer being 9999. So they simply say, that's it. If you don't pay the money, you stay the rest of your life in Israel. It doesn't matter. There's no compassionate grounds, nothing.
I think the news did mention about a Jewish man in Israel that had 999 written in his no exit order. I'm not sure why that was. So what's your message, Ronnie? Give all my listeners a message of what should they do exactly. I mean, give us a message for the people living in Israel and for the people living abroad. What are the two messages you want to give to them?
Well, if you're already in Israel and you're aware of what's going on in Israel, you should leave as soon as you can to save your own life. Unfortunately, many people don't listen to this message, and the message has to be crystal clear. You're paying with your life by migrating to Israel or staying in Israel. You got to understand, as a man, you have no rights to freedom, no rights to assets, to your children, to work, to anything. You are destroyed by the system in case of divorce. There's no equality, there's no protection, there's no human rights. You can be destroyed completely, as I was myself. My life was completely destroyed by the system. It doesn't have there's no grounds to appeal. The appeal process is endless. You have no financial resources. And if a man fights in Israel against this system, he's fined horrific penalties by the family or the rabbinical court, who says, we're going to disincentivize you from contesting our decisions. And huge fines that can equal, 100,000 shekel over 2 years, which is $33,000 in fines.
You're saying you're not allowed to appeal a decision even?
You can appeal, but the problem is they'll punish you for making an appeal, for contesting a judge's decision in Israel. They'll punish you and force you to pay the other side's legal fees. And in some cases, you're talking about tens of thousands of dollars in fines and in fees. When you want to apply for an appeal, in some cases, you're paying $5,000 per appeal in court fees alone just to appeal. And compare that, for instance, to the United States, where the maximum fee you pay is $450 to file a lawsuit in the United States court. In Israel, there is no such system whatsoever in place. They disincentivize you from filing an appeal. They'll say, you want to appeal, we're going to punish you for appealing our decisions. You're trying to appeal to remove it, to give yourself freedom, we'll punish you even further. And what it does, the man's debts just keep increasing at 2% per month in interest. So after a year, the debts multiply. And the man has no way out. And that's what leads to suicide. He has no way out. He can't fight the system. He can't fight to see his children. He can't fight for his assets. He can't fight for his freedom. He's destroyed completely. He is at a loss. He can't survive.
Do you get at least supervised visitation with the children, or they just take away all visitation from you?
In my case, the social services and the children's lawyer wanted me to have proper half custody and proper visitation 3 times a week. So it'd be half and half, which is the so-called default issue of parenthood. But they understood I had nowhere to live. I was homeless. I was living in a shared room of 150 square foot. I could not physically take my 3 children. I had no car. They suspended my driver's license during that period for unpaid debts. So I couldn't drive a car. I had no bank accounts. They lien every bank account you have. So if you receive any money to a bank account, it's automatically removed from your account and liened.
Wow.
And the money is given to a woman. So you can't work. The moment you work, your entire salary can be garnished with a lien on your account. You can't see your children. You've got no home. You've got nothing to survive. You've got no car. You can't run a car. You got no income. They say, fine, you can go and see your kids. You can't take care of them. You've got no roof over your head. You've got no income. You've got no car. You've got no food even. How are you going to take care and how are you going to take care of your kids? They don't care.
No, I understand.
They don't care.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. Go ahead. I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, and I'll tell you another thing. Even if a man comes into a marriage in Israel with all the assets came from him. He owned an apartment before the marriage. He sold the apartment, has a successful business. It means nothing. All the assets are given to the woman. The children are given to the woman. The car, which is a joint owned car, is given to the woman. The furniture in the apartment. A man leaves an apartment in Israel or a house with nothing, with the clothes on his back. He's thrown on the street. He has no rights to his home.
I remember my question now. So you are advising men who are already living in Israel to get out of there. Now, I want you to contemplate, if a man has a good marriage, he's thinking to himself, why should I pick up and move my whole family abroad based on a 1% chance? I mean, I agree with you that when she files for divorce, you're going to be turned into a nothing. You know, you're going to be zero, minus. But it's a very difficult decision for Israelis to make based on a future prediction. Maybe, you understand?
Okay, I look at that point, but you have to understand the Western world is all the same. 35% of people get divorced, which is more than 1 in 3. It's between 1 in 3 and 1 in 2. So those are very high statistics worldwide. It doesn't matter which country in the world, but in normal society, divorce isn't as traumatic as it is in Israel. It's traumatic everywhere, but not to the same extent as Israel. Assets are divided fairly. Child support's calculated on physical numbers of proven income. In Israel, it doesn't work that way. In Israel, all the assets go, there is no division of assets in Israel. It all goes to the woman. The children automatically granted to the woman. And the man has nothing. He has no rights. He has no rights for visitation for his children, no rights to his home. Even if he owned the home fully before marriage, he owned properties before marriage. They don't care. There's no other society in the world in divorce where a man comes with everything into a marriage and leaves with nothing, and the woman comes with nothing and leaves with everything. It's simply ridiculous. A court in a civilized country will look at what the assets each party had before they entered marriage. There's absolutely no way that that man with all the assets loses everything and the woman comes into marriage with nothing and gains everything, including the children. It's absurd. It's barbarity. I mean, people in the New York Times, they wrote an article about an American woman trapped in Saudi Arabia. And that's the exact extreme opposite of Israel. In Saudi Arabia and many of these Muslim countries in the Middle East, the man has all the rights. But in Israel, it's exactly 180 degrees of that. The woman has all the rights in Israel. The man has zero rights in Israel, not to assets, not to children, not to anything, not even to freedom. And it's a disgrace.
Does this happen to even the highest echelon of Israeli society, people who are like high military figures, or just to low people?
It does happen as well, but in many cases, the high echelons of society do have the money to pay the extortionate deposits in order to leave the country. So in many cases, very wealthy people aren't trapped in the country because they can easily pay the bond. But average working class or businessmen who can't pay the bond because their assets are all liened in Israel and their property is liened, is trapped. He can't come up with the child support. He can't come up with the security payments because his money is mortgaged. In my case, I owned an apartment worth more than $2 million, and they considered that not to be enough security. I mean, I have a prenuptial agreement which clearly states I pay the woman $100,000 for every child she brings into the world. And her lawyers and the judge decided, okay, we'll interpret this differently. We've decided that $100,000 is per child per year of marriage.
Mhm.
I said, based on what? Because we say so. And now you owe millions of dollars. So your $2 million apartment is not sufficient security to leave the country. We decided you owe $5 million now. If you can't pay that money, you're trapped in the country. You can live and die in Israel. That's all we care.
Right. Society can't continue existing this way. I don't see how society can continue existing because people should be afraid to get married.
Listen, for a man to consider getting married in Israel, and knowing what I know now, what I've been through myself, if someone would have told me this 2 years ago that this was possible, I'd say they were insane. This can't be. Not in a Western democratic society that the courts can treat me like an animal. I say to myself, it's a nightmare that any man who values his own life has to consider this as, I cannot live in the state of Israel. I cannot live there. I don't. If something goes wrong, I'm lost. I'm finished. And what it leads to is many men in Israel who have migrated to Israel are living in very unhappy marriages because they realize what happens if they get divorced. They know they lose their children, they lose their home, they lose their freedom, they lose everything, and probably their own life. So you have people who are suffering in an unhappy divorce who continue. They're afraid. What the consequences? The woman's lawyer will destroy me. If I don't keep the woman happy, I lose everything. I lose my children. So it's a society of extortion, of an extreme feminist organization who've controlled the courts and the rabbinical courts in Israel and all the politicians. And the society is saying we want to make women equal. This is not about equality.
No.
In Israel, the woman has everything. She has everything. She's guaranteed everything. The man has nothing. He has no right to freedom, no right to work, no right to his children, no right to his home. He is nothing.
Right. So your advice, of course, is do not marry an Israeli woman. Do not visit Israel if you suspect your wife wants to divorce you. And don't settle in Israel. Yeah, it's a tough one. People, unless it happens to them, most people don't realize that the pile of bricks falls very quickly on them, on top of them. They cannot get out.
Exactly. I don't believe any man, knowing what I know now, and other divorced men, would give any advice to anyone to make Aliyah, to decide to live in the state of Israel, and to base his life in Israel, simply based on the risk of what happens, what the society will do to him if the marriage breaks down.
The human nature is, until it doesn't happen to you, nobody wants to take any measures, even though the Torah says always a smart person always looks ahead, plan ahead. The average person thinks of the land of Israel from a biblical point of view. It's the Holy Land. It's the aspiration of every Jew. And they don't want to think about these things. But I think that based on what your testimony is, it's pretty serious and pretty dire. Very frightening.
Very much so. It's a frightening issue. And I couldn't recommend anybody, any man in the world, in the Western world, to consider even moving to Israel, marrying an Israeli woman and visiting the state of Israel, knowing that his freedom is at risk. And that's the thing. And until a person loses his freedom, he doesn't know what it means. It's only when your freedom is taken away from you and you're trapped in a prison that you feel that this is the most important aspect of life, of humanity, that a person has the right to be free. And that's the fundamental right in Israel they don't respect. In Israel, we have a basic law, which is ridiculous. It was passed by the Knesset in 1992, which states every person is free to leave Israel. Every person is treated with fairness and dignity by society. It's become an absolute joke, because what sort of dignity is there for a man who's trapped in the country, penniless, has no rights to see his children, no right to a roof over his head, no right to money to survive? If that's not loss of dignity, what is? I ask myself that question every day.
I would imagine it's also a waste of time and money to hire a lawyer in Israel. If the system is so rigid and fixed, why spend thousands of dollars on attorneys?
Listen, I went through 3 lawyers in Israel, and none of them produced any results. You may have the best legal argument in the world. You may have a very good lawyer who's very methodical and could show the facts to the judge, but it doesn't mean anything. You might as well represent yourself. It's a kangaroo court. You're not dealing with a fair judge or a fair court system which listens to both sides. And in general, what I want to tell you is that the judicial system in Israel in general was very good. I've been involved in litigation against banks in Israel, against companies, and there is fairness in the normal judicial system in Israel. It works very fairly and very properly.
Except in divorce.
Except in divorce.
Mhm.
Divorce is like a political issue in Israel, and the courts, the family courts, have judges which are appointed based on the feminist agenda. They're handpicked and hand selected for that purpose. The rabbinical courts have the same sort of process. The process and the agenda is to make sure that the children are well compensated and given plenty of money for all their needs and necessities. And how that's calculated, no one knows. I mean, the average child, they say in Israel, requires 1,200 shekels, which is like $350 a month to survive and to have basic needs of food and clothing and other stuff. But in Israel, in many cases, they award child support payments which are more than the person's salary. It's completely unbelievable. How can a court order the person to pay child support at a level that's more than their income?
So what does the judge tell you when you complain, I don't earn that kind of money? What do they tell you?
The judge says it's nothing to do with your income. It's got to do with the children's needs. The child support decisions are based on the children's needs. It's not relevant whether you're poor or rich or anything else.
I find it
It's not
very
relevant.
ironic, though, but if you are married to the same woman and you cannot afford to support your family, they won't take your children away then. It's only the minute she files for divorce, all of a sudden you're a bad father. And they take away your children and they make you pay money that you don't have. But when you're married, nobody does that to you. That doesn't make
Exactly.
sense.
The point is the rules of the game change the moment you're divorced in Israel.
Right.
It's
right.
like the court in Israel telling me now that the social services have incredible power in Israel. Come to Israel, visit your children. We encourage you to take your children on holiday, to spend 10 days a month with them in Israel and have proper access to your children, their interests. But what happens then? If I had come to Israel now, even after paying this ridiculous
They'll
ransom,
lock you up.
which is
They'll lock you up.
$150,000, I can be trapped again in Israel.
Right.
I was in Israel 2 months ago, and my divorcee filed another no exit order against me the day after I left. The intention is to lock me in the country, to destroy me
Wow.
in every way possible, so I cannot see my kids. I can't support them. I can't provide for them. I have no roof over my head, and to kill myself.
Right.
The system allows multiple applications for no exit orders, and they're granted arbitrarily, just simply based on a woman's request. There is nothing the woman has to lose. A no exit order costs the woman $85. She applies for a no exit order, fills out a form, puts the details and say, I fear my husband's going to leave and not pay child support in the future. I've got no evidence of that, but I just feel that's the case. And automatically the no exit order is granted.
Now, what happens
10
in
minutes
Israel?
later, it's in the system.
Okay, what happens in Israel if it's the opposite? You're married to a woman, she files a divorce, but she's super wealthy and you're not. Can you get child support from her or alimony from her if she's wealthy?
It's totally irrelevant in Israel. The rabbinical court and the family court feel all the financial obligations is on the husband, not on the wife. She has not obliged to do anything. In my case, my ex-wife went to court and said the fridge is empty. The children have no food. The husband doesn't care about the children. And this is the person who locked me in the country with a no exit order, who has more than $1 million in the bank, and the judge doesn't care. And they can go to court and say, oh, my kids are starving. I have $1 million in the bank, but the kids are starving. If that isn't evidence of how idiotic and ridiculous the system is, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
None whatsoever.
Wow. Amazing. All right, my listeners, you heard it from Ronnie's mouth himself, what's going on. I mean, you couldn't describe it any better. I've been saying this all along, and I want to thank you so much for sharing your story with our listeners. Is there any other parting words you want to say?
My final words I'd like to say, I'm an average guy. I was a very Zionistic guy, believed in living in Israel, wanting to have a Jewish wife. If you value your sanity and your life, avoid the state of Israel like the plague. There is absolutely no motivation to come from a Western world to risk your life going to Israel. You can lose your children, your home, your car, all your assets and your freedom, and in some cases, your own life. It is simply not worth the risk. The risk is just too high. I mean, that's if a society is prepared to trap you in the country and take away those basic fundamental human rights, Israel is not the place to live. And that's a lot of pain when I say that, because I came from a very pro-Zionist family and a very Jewish family. who really believed in the state of Israel, that people should marry Jewish women and have Jewish children in Israel and have a very strong Jewish society. And I see the opposite. It's nothing to do with Judaism. It's got to do with state-sponsored sanctions of murder, what they're doing to men. They're driving men to suicide. I believe the family courts in Israel, since its inception in 1995, has murdered more men than have died in all wars, COVID and terrorism combined. That's how horrific the statistics are. That's the three statistics. They have killed more men than have died in all wars, all acts of terrorism and COVID combined. And that's a horrific statistic.
Where can someone find this statistic? Where can that be found?
We can look on the CIA World Factbook on how many men died in all of wars and terrorism and COVID, and you can combine the statistics, multiplied by the divorces in Israel and the suicides. 7 to 8 times more likely a man is to commit suicide when he's divorced than when he's happily married. Those statistics in itself are published by the Ministry of Health in Israel. So they're considered factual. The government can't deny those facts. But the fact is they don't care. There's no inquiry in the Knesset in Israel as to what exactly is happening, that men are hanging themselves, driving into brick walls, jumping off buildings. It's happening all the time. And the real numbers are probably many multiples of the official statistics. When a man takes a box of sleeping pills and kills himself and doesn't wake up, oh, it's an accidental death. Or a man drives his car into a brick wall into the back of the truck, oh, that was a car accident. Who's to say it wasn't a suicide? The real numbers could be 1,000 men a year are dying from suicide from this system. Not only suicide, this system is driving men to cardiac arrest, to heart attacks, and to premature death as well. So you got many multiples. It could be 2,000 men a year are losing their lives in Israel based on this horrific system.
Yes, this
and
is
it's
the
only
hardest.
the 2,000 men. What about their mothers? What about their sisters and brothers? They're all suffering.
This is the hardest part for people to swallow and understand. They look at Israel as a Jewish state. They don't think Jews are capable of doing this, so they're not on the lookout. It's kind of similar to what I've said in my channel before. I've mentioned recently in the recent politics that the religious minister, Matan Kahana, removed from the Israeli Rabbinate their services regarding conversions and kashrut, but they didn't remove them from divorce, which is the most horrendous one that caused the most damage. And I would rather have Reformed Jews run that department than the rabbinate, because what happens is when the rabbinate runs that department, people who are not smart think because they're black hat, black suit, bearded men, that their divorces are kosher when they're not. So basically, they're marrying women who are married, and the sin of Eshet Ish is there. Same thing here. People are fooled into thinking, let me make aliyah to the Jewish state. It's the Jewish state. It's my homeland. But basically, you're moving to the land of Eretz Israel, which was given to us by Hashem, which is a good land, but it's being occupied by Nazis, essentially people who are very, very anti-social order. And that's what's very frightening. So I appreciate your insight, your experience, and may Hashem help you soon and help all of us soon to achieve tzedek, righteousness, and B'ezrat Hashem, we should meet again. Thanks again, Ronnie.